All right, so some of you might have seen this on Unbelievable. I believe it was 2 weeks ago at this point. This is a conversation. It's more like a conversation between Cosmic Skeptic and Lukas Ruegger. I think he's calling his channel Deflate now. I'm not sure if that's exactly how you pronounce his name. I sincerely doubt it is. But I want to play at least some of it. I only have about an hour before wifey comes home. But if however much I get through, I'm going to try to skip ahead a little and just start from about 10 minutes into it, because there's a really good section of this video. I strongly recommend you check out this discussion because it's actually excellent. It's one of the best I've seen in a long time. So I'm going to go through it and try to comment on it. Here we go.
I think, than to produce a worldview to try and defend. If you're just somebody who's able to take arguments for God's existence and poke holes in them, I think you've got a bit of an easier ride. But there are a few things you can do to say that actually maybe God does not exist. Now, this doesn't commit you to the view that God doesn't exist. You don't have to say that that's what you actually believe. You can still be on the fence, but perhaps you're on the fence because you think there are good arguments.
So I skipped ahead about 10 minutes because I want to get into the meat of it. There's some really good stuff, particularly that Cosmic Skeptic says, that I think it's one of the most honest conversations I've seen online in a long time. He's really honest in this, and it goes places that I think are really interesting and cool. So
arguments this way, good arguments that way. So one good argument that way might be this problem of divine hiddenness. And there are a few different ways to approach it, but it's a fairly intuitive point that if there were a God who existed, and particularly a God who loved us and wanted to.
For those of you who've already seen the this broadcast, first of all, I strongly recommend you go check it out in full. It's really worth watching. But there's a part that I found interesting where he starts talking about how his relationship has changed to the arguments from God over the years. That's to me the most interesting part of it. Cosmic Skeptic's relationship.
Enter into a relationship with anybody who was willing and able. It seems surprising, at the very least, that so many people are restricted from experience of or with this God for so much of the time. Now, a lot of people like to think of this as a version of the problem of evil. It basically falls under the same category of why does God allow bad thing to happen? Because, of course, for an atheist, it might not be seen as bad that you don't have a religious experience, but if there were a God who existed and he restricted his presence from human beings, that would be a bad thing. It would be much better if we could all be sort of happily in relation with him all the time. So it's essentially a version of the problem of evil, but it's quite a particular one, and it's quite a potent one, because it's one of the main things that I think causes people to lose their faith. I wouldn't say it's one of these things that sustains atheism argumentatively. It's not brought up so much, but in the experience of a believer who ends up throwing off their faith, it's often because they go through a period of just silence from deaf heaven, as it were, and they don't really know how to make sense of that. Of course, there are.
That's probably true. It's rare that you see an atheist. Obviously you don't see atheists who feel connected to church and feel like they're having religious experiences. That's pretty rare, Craig. Yeah, that would be pretty rare. They probably wouldn't become an atheist. But yeah, it's one of the more common objections. And I forget if he actually tried. There's the Schellenberg argument is actually trying to formalize it as an argument. I forget the exact framing of that, but it's something like, if there are non-resistant non-belief, you wouldn't expect any. The gist of it is, you would not expect any non-resistant non-believers if there is a God, and non-resistant non-believers exist. That's the part that I would debate, because I would say, according to who? According to the non-believer. Well, how do we know you're non-resistant? I say so. Well, how do we know that you're really non-resistant? That's where I think why it doesn't quite work as an argument against an ontology, because it is relying on. I didn't mean to get into this right just yet, but it is relying on the self-reporting of the so-called non-resistant non-believer. And I'm somewhat skeptical that they are reporting accurately. I think they might think they're non-resistant, but I doubt that they are. I'll address that again if it comes up. I don't think it will. I don't remember them getting into too much of that on this, but we'll see.
Ways to try and make sense of this, right? And so historically, people have put forward lots of suggestions as to why it might be that God is hiding his face from us. There might be sort of sufficient moral warrant. It might be better for our character.
By the way, the Bible literally says, surely you are a God who hides his face. And it also says, seek and you will find.
Might sort of be impinging upon our ability to freely come to know him if he makes his existence constantly present to us. There are these kinds of responses. These are often very similar to the kind of responses that you get to the problem of evil. It's essentially just a suggestion that there might be some kind of sufficient moral warrant. For me, these responses just don't cut it. At least they seem a bit ad hoc to me. And I imagine we'll be getting into discussing a few of those. But really the argument is that if there were, I mean, you can put it quite formally as Schellenberg famously did in saying that if there is a God who exists who's perfectly loving, then non-resistant non-belief would not occur.
And what can you just, for those who haven't come across Schellenberg's version of it, what does this non-resistant bit mean?
It's an important distinction. Of course, there are non-believers who could be described as resistant to belief in God for various reasons. Maybe your anti-theists who say, well, I don't think it's true, but I don't want it to be true. Or people who, we all know that some people in approaching certain topics will almost subconsciously, but somehow willingly, if they don't want something to be true, blind themselves to particular kinds of evidence. This is something you
see. Now this is where it starts. Okay, this is where the good part starts. That was a really perceptive, honest statement that you don't necessarily hear often coming out of the mouths of an atheist. There are obviously some people who are resistant to the idea of God. Now, they might even self-report as non-resistant. That's the problem. The analogy I used in one of my past videos is the mom who doesn't want to admit that a kid is smoking weed. She might even find weed in his pocket while she's going, and, you know, somehow we all know people in alcoholics land. They call it denial. What's the biggest river in Egypt? Denial. Denial is the biggest. You know, we all know people who, for whatever reason, studiously avoid dealing with the obvious because they don't want to acknowledge it. So in order for the Schellenberg version of the argument to hold merit, there has to be people who we know for a fact. That's the part that the argument has to account for, that we know for a fact. Because there are people who are less resistant. You know, there are the debunked, dismissed, discredited atheists who I call the debate me bros, and all they do is try and jerk your chain whenever you're in a conversation about religion. But then there are the honest actor atheists. And of the honest actor atheists, I could easily categorize them. A lot of them would self-report as non-resistant. Therein lies the irony, because he is going to tell him. The irony is the less inclined you are, the more you acknowledge your resistance, the more likely you are non-resistant. If you say, I'm not non-resistant, then you can't see where your resistance is. From my experience with everybody, atheist, Christian, Jew, miscellaneous, everybody is resistant to God to some degree or another. Everybody. And I believe that there are atheists who are a lot more non-resistant than other atheists, for sure. Answers from Reason Crew are the least resistant. There was this guy, Brett, who Pleasure of Doubt. Brett, if you're listening, you know, where'd you go? He disappeared from Twitter and YouTube. He now kind of runs the John Vervaeke. What's that stupid app called? Discord. He runs the John Vervaeke, and since he's been doing that, he sort of disappeared off of Twitter. He was very non-resistant. Now, I did a thing with him where I was going to try and give him religious rituals. He was the most non-resistant I had ever found outside of the Answers from Reason Crew. And this is a very instructive point, because I did a thing where I was like, I put out a challenge to atheists. You know, I could give you a series of rituals and things to read over a course of 5 or 6 months, and I bet you $1,000 you come to some sort of belief in God. Now, he's the only one who took me up on that, because he was non-resistant enough to take me up on that. But the first part of that was me asking him a lot of questions. Okay, this is very illuminating. Why was I asking him a lot of questions? Because he was the least evangelical, most non-resistant atheist I ever met. But I was asking him a lot of questions. I had a series of things that I wanted to dig into, because I wanted to find out where his resistance actually was. Wasn't that obvious? It was the least resistant atheist I'd come across. but I was sure there was some there that I was going to find. And if the experiment was to be successful, if I was going to lead him to faith after a series of months, I had to figure out where that resistance was. Does that make sense? Yes, it does. You see what I'm saying? So there are degrees of resistance for sure. There's the debate me, bro, in your face. You can't even speak a word about God without them trying to debunk, discredit you. And then there's the reasonable atheist, the Answers from Reason crew. Reasonable except for Dave Rollins. he's not reasonable, but the rest of them are reasonable, and they are non-resistant up to a point. But I'm sure if I dug in and asked them questions, questions that were designed to uncover their resistance, I'd uncover resistance. A lot of Christians are resistant. Hello? Yeah, that's the truth. Okay, continue.
See on both sides of the debate. So some people resist, right? And so if I was just look, I'm not going to read that nonsense. I'm not going to read the gospel. I'm not going to engage in the debate. But all of this religious stuff is ridiculous. Somebody would probably have a right to say to me, look, you're obviously not seeking properly. But
yeah, and that used to be the standard operating procedure of the new atheists. This is all ridiculous. We don't have to take this seriously at all. We don't have to seek. Why? Because it's all junk. It's all nonsense. Okay, well, you ain't gonna find.
Non-resistant non-believer is the person who has no objection to entering into a relationship with God, and in fact desires it. And this would be someone like myself, I think.
That's the key. As far as we know, no objection, and as far as they are self-reporting, no objection. But I'm almost positive I would find some objections if I sat down with them and really, really dug in. Now, they are non-resistant as compared to other atheists. But here's where this conversation starts to get really interesting, because I'm going to really focus on Cosmic Skeptic, because this is possibly the most honest read I've ever seen from an atheist. And I'm only going to do an hour today, but I may come back to this because this is, like I said, this is a really good conversation.
Look, if it's there, I'm here for it. I really am. I'm open to it. That is, I'm non-resistant to this belief in God. And so the reason we add that non-resistant clause is to say that is to prevent somebody from saying, well, maybe you're just sort of hardening your heart.
The other thing is to keep in mind about non-resistance. There are other people who are very non-resistant. Philip Goff, who has a thing called the secular Christian. He may even call himself a Christian that doesn't believe in the metaphysics or the ontology. It wouldn't surprise me if those guys become believers. The people who are truly non-resistant. John Vervaeke, I pointed out, very non-resistant. Streams with Christians, always says positive things about Christianity. Alex, this Cosmic Skeptic guy, I keep calling him Alex. Is his name actually Alex? I forget. The Cosmic Skeptic right here is going to show himself to be very non-resistant. But in the process, also show me our work with this person is done. We have done the apologist job. We've presented a version of the gospel that is the most palatable it can be to someone who is as non-resistant as they can be. That's their job. I don't expect people to become completely non-resistant. I expect them to really be honest with where they're at. And if they have resistance, be honest about why. And it's up to us, the apologists in defense of the faith, to present to them the most palatable version of the gospel, the most easy to digest version of the gospel we can present. Even Paul said it. He said, I give you milk because you aren't ready for solid food, but it's, and then take it from there. I think wouldn't surprise me if Philip Goff becomes a Christian. Wouldn't surprise me if John Vervaeke becomes a theist. Wouldn't surprise me if a lot of these really, truly non-resistant people become theists, because that tends to be what happens if you're actually non-resistant.
Art or something like this. As long as there is a single example, just one, of a truly non-resistant non-believer, then it seems that the theist needs to explain why it is that God would hide his face from them, or at least give us plausible reason to think that there could be such a reason.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a really helpful way into the argument. So yeah, and I think we meet this in a kind of non-philosophical.
Yes, that was a helpful way into the argument. It was really, really well said.
Form quite a lot, don't we, Lukas? It's people saying, well, I haven't. I'm open to God, but God hasn't shown up in my life. So surely it's down to God in the end. And if God's there, then God will know what to do to make me believe, and that kind of thing. So yeah, where do you start with this one?
Yeah, definitely. And I would also add, I think it's something that even the Christian or the believer can relate to, in the sense that they will experience, periods or times where they feel like, well, where is God? I can.
Such a great point. That's such a great point that he went there. And why this conversation is so good is that a lot of Christians wouldn't go there. Alex, I keep calling him Alex. His name actually Alex Cosmic. His name Alex. I think that might actually be his name, but Cosmic Skeptic. Yeah, I guess it's Alex O'Connor. It sounds right, but I'm unwilling to commit to that. I think it's Alex O'Connor. It seems right. But the Cosmic Skeptic dropped his guard and gets honest, and so does our friend here. So this turns into a really honest conversation that can't be had between a lot of theists and atheists. Why? Because as soon as you drop your guard, the one on the other guy in the other squad's gonna try to score fake points.
Read the Bible or go to church, but it feels like there is nothing tangible or nothing relatable. So in this sense, I do think that intuitively the argument makes sense and or should make sense, I think, even.
And now those are exactly the future potential deconverts, the guys who are going to church and I ain't feeling it, going in my prayer closet and coming up with blanks. Those are the people who can eventually, potentially deconvert from Christianity.
To the Christian. Now, I just very generally speaking, like one of the responses or one of the basic things to think about when divine hiddenness comes up is this. If, like, on what grounds are we to believe that, this one argument, if you refer to how Schellenberg put it, the argument from divine hiddenness against God's existence, in what sense are we to believe that the assertion or the perception of the skeptic or of someone like Schellenberg that there isn't enough evidence for God kind of throws out all we know from natural theology and does so objectively speaking? So it seems like you have divine hiddenness as an argument on the one side, and on the other side you have all the data you get or all the arguments you get from natural theology. And it seems like on a very basic level that the argument as such seems to kind of claim that all of this needs to be put aside, because natural theology as such is basically the claim that you look at the world as it is, you don't need special revelation, and with the data you get, you can.
Right. So he's saying, divine hiddenness, you kidding me? Look at these resurrection argument. Look at all this facts. Look at all this, look at all our evidentiary apologetics. What do you mean divine hiddenness? Look at the data, dude.
Make inference to the existence of God. So I think that's one of the big.
I'm not saying that this is the right objection. I'm just saying this is potentially a good point. I think the real meat of it is the personal, because this is where Alex is going to excel in this, because he's going to start talking about what he really means, and what is really meant is the personal relationship, not the arguments. The arguments are okay. The personal relationship is make or break. That's really where you go into your prayer closet and you honestly feel like you are contacting an ontology. Guess what? You're going to stay a Christian. The religious experience it ultimately points back to, I think. Well, let's see. I'll be quiet. I'll let them talk.
Basic issues that you would want to look at when the argument comes up.
So the point being that the fact that there is this objection of the hiddenness of God doesn't necessarily outweigh all of those other issues.
Exactly, because again, when you look at fine-tuning or cosmological arguments, I mean, these are ways that even atheist thinkers would say. And I mean, Alex, you've made kind of comments recently where you feel like, well, there has been raised credence in these arguments with how you've looked at them again.
Right, and that's exactly the way to think of these arguments. And our job as evidentiary apologetics is to polish up these arguments and strengthen them to the point where they actually give enough sufficient evidentiary warrant to the non-believer to have the non-believer then pick up the cross, start seeking so they might find. That's the goal, to make the argument strong enough that they stand or fall based on their own merits, and they get someone like Apologia or Cosmic Skeptic here to go, you know what? These guys, there's truth in this. I got to go back in that prayer closet, and I got to tithe to Craig Reed. More important.
And so the question is, well, now, like, what weighs heavier? Is it the divine hiddenness argument, which basically says there is not enough evidence for a person to believe in God, or is it the stuff that is being talked about in natural theology? So
what do you want to say to that, Alex?
Well, the divine hiddenness problem, I don't think I would characterize it as the problem that there sort of isn't enough evidence per se. It's more something about the effect that evidence has on the person who's considering belief. So, I think there's a great deal of good evidence in terms of what is argumentatively sound. The fine-tuning argument, you can make responses to it, but it's a powerful consideration. Why are the consonants so finely tuned? The argument from reason seems to be a powerful sort of undercutting reason to sort of distrust our very reasoning faculties on atheism. These kinds of things, I think they are powerful argumentatively. In a kind of academic sense, they're easy to defend and difficult to argue against. But of course, particularly for Christianity, religion is not about natural theology. Natural theology is this strange philosophical wart on the side of what is supposed to be this glorious relationship with a loving person.
I don't know if the natural theologians will appreciate being compared to a wart, but
perhaps not.
We'll let that go.
But I feel like it's such a. It seems to me, if Christianity were true, it would be the sort of wrong way to be approaching this kind of conversation.
In practice, we don't all walk around as philosophers, when we're Christians, and I've always worried slightly that maybe a lot of the non-Christians and atheists who watch these shows and yours think that, well, this must be what Christianity is. If I was a Christian, I'd just be going around quoting the ontological argument or something, and that's not quite the reality.
Well, I think it rises up as a response to sort of your intellectual atheists of history who said, look, we've got this kind of academic way of viewing the world. We like to put things in a microscope. We like to formalize and mathematize this kind of thing, and we've sort of tried to sort of taxonomize the entire world into this complete scientific understanding that if we manage to fill out, we'll explain everything. And the theist comes along and says, well, actually, I'm not so sure about that. And they start sort of arguing on those terms. And you end up with this highly academic, formalized premise conclusion, which, of course, I find interesting. I've made a career out of discussing this stuff for the past half decade. But of course, I'm an atheist, right? Like I think that this is sort of interesting from a philosophical perspective. But if I were a Christian, I would think that this is not where I would expect to find the focal point of the Christian faith. This is supposed to be about a relationship. I think, look, if God is not...
What he articulated really well here is something that like Jay from England could potentially articulate on the Christian side. It's not about these arguments. It's not about, and some ontological argument. It's not about that. It is ultimately supposed to be about an actual lifeblood connection to God. And that's kind of what he's saying. And I think that's, he said it really well. And I think there's a lot. I don't know. This is getting good. I'm kind of just in the position where I should just be quiet and listen, because this is why I found this conversation really excellent. You know what I'm saying?
Revealed himself through prayer or reflection or through religious experience. It'd be very bizarre indeed for me to kind of put my eye down a microscope, look at like a particular way that an atom wriggles or something, and go, there he is. It would be a very strange place for him to reveal himself. And so I wouldn't expect, so when I say that sort of the natural theological arguments, that they're argumentatively sound, I think they are, but they don't move me. And I don't think they move.
Well, and the other thing though, too, is that the way apologetics is broken down is kind of how we had to, because the atheists were coming at Christianity on eggheady intellectual grounds. Well, there's no solid evidence for Scarfer, and it's all, and they were attacking. That's what I said. The first thing they came at was, and it was fertile territory for the growth of atheism, was the soft underbelly of Christianity, which is fundamentalist Christianity and the dumb type of fundamentalists. There may be an intellectually rigorous, intellectually defensible version of fundamentalist Christianity. There may be. I'm not saying there absolutely is not, but that's the soft underbelly of Christianity, which is what they came for first. So we came into the space as apologists, and the first order of business was, getting, I started this 5 years ago, and the first order of business for me was like, well, wait, what are these arguments? Because I had to first check that. When my sister listened to my video, when I went back to New York about a year or two ago, she listened to some of my videos and she started asking me about the philosophical arguments. Like, well, yeah, I don't necessarily think the Kalam is a great argument, but I can't, when people start talking about the Kalam cosmological argument, I have to know what I'm talking about. I have to be well versed in some of these things on intellectual ground. So it's twofold. It's really, it's twofold. He's correct in that at the church you go to, at the church I go to, nobody knows about apologetics and ontological argument. Look at you like you had two heads. Like I said, I think I've said this in other videos, maybe 1 in 10 people I know in actual church who are actual Christians even knows what apologetics is. Usually you have to define, usually they go, what is apologetics? And you have to define that. So that's what we're talking about in church. And some of those people know how to pray. Some of those people know how to seek God, are really, really satisfied Christians in terms of their walk with the Lord, what the Christian calls their walk with the Lord. So he's onto something important. Let's say that. And he's talking about it in a way that's, really sharp, really smart.
A lot of people, and I think if you ask people why they convert to Christianity or to theism from atheism, very rarely do they report that it's because they sat down and read a particular argument in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology.
Sometimes that
he's about to say the exceptions. Jonathan McClatchy and I think even Edward Fazer, I think, is an exception. But yeah, he's about to say the exceptions. I cut him off.
Is part of a wider picture. Obviously, there is some kind of intellectual questions that got answered, and then perhaps there was also an additional experience or whatever. But yeah, how would you want to respond, Lukas?
Yeah, so let me just rephrase that back to you, just in order to make sure I understand you properly. So are you basically saying that there needs to be a way to experience God, or to have like an experiential aspect to your relationship to God, rather than just an intellectual kind of wrestling and argumenting?
I went on a strange detour, but I didn't actually, I think I didn't actually quite get to the point, which is my fault, which is that if there is a lot of evidence, the problem is not so much whether that evidence has been provided, but why that evidence doesn't move a person. Because you could provide all the evidence in the world, but if I'm just of this kind of psychological constitution where it just doesn't land with me, you could say something like, there's a sense in which you might want to say, well, that's kind of on you because there is enough evidence and you're just not accepting it for some reason. But whatever that reason is as mysterious to me as it is to you. Like, why is it that somebody will say to me, look, you have all of this evidence, you have the fine-tuning argument, you have the cosmological considerations, you have like your moral intuition, all of this kind of stuff. Like, why are you not a theist? To which I just want to say, well, that's a good question. Yeah. Why not? Why is it, indeed, that in the face of all of these supposed evidences, I am just not moved? Now, it might be something to do with me. It might be that I'm doing it wrong. It might be that I'm sort of not opening my heart to God. But I at least feel as though I've done that. And I'd like...
See, this becomes just a general philosophical question, about what actually moves the needle in a human being. From, the job of the evidentiary apologetics is to present the strongest possible compelling evidentiary case to get somebody to move the needle. Now, this is a different philosophical conversation as to why isn't the needle being moved, right? Now, this is where Christians usually throw out unhelpful accusations. Maybe Alex just wants to sin. Maybe he's but he's asking the correct question in the right way, and he starts to get really insightful. He's been insightful the whole time, I give you that, but starts to get really insightful, like, whoa.
To ask any theist who thinks I'm not what they would advise that I do if they think that I've not been doing it properly.
Great question. Genetically modified skeptic, if you watch this, that question could have come out of your mouth. That's a great question. What can I do differently if I'm... See, this is what true non-resistance looks like, though. You see how this is so much different than just saying, I'm a non-resistant non-believer. Now let me defend that propositionally. You aren't a non-resistant non-believer. This is what true non-resistant looks like. I really am trying. And I'm really thinking about, why haven't I moved? Why don't I believe if this evidence is good? And what am I doing wrong? He's really wrestling. This is somebody who's actually wrestling with what is being presented to him in an honest way. You hear the difference in how he grapples with this stuff. He's legitimately grappling and asking penetrating questions, not of us. You ready for this? Can I have a drum roll? It's not asking penetrating questions of us, which Matt Dillahunty can do. Any atheist can do. He's asking them of himself.
But so it's not so much about.
Ooh, gotcha. Pine Creek, did you hear that? Pine Creek, did you hear that? Because that's really, I know Nathan will listen to that. Why? Because they're honest enough to hear that. Pine Creek, if you listen to this video, listen to that. It's not asking honest questions of other people, right? Which is what you do round the boards. He's asking honest questions of himself. Maybe that is what is ultimately entailed in the phrase, seek and you will find. It goes on to say, I will be found of you, not directly there, but the Bible goes, if you search for me with all your heart. That's what he's doing right now.
The evidence, but rather the sort of lack of potency that the evidence has in actually forming a belief within a person.
Okay, so I guess then we're really talking about, well, a person like yourself looking at the evidence, and I think that the crucial term there is it doesn't move you. So what do you? I mean, could you kind of mention another example where the evidence moves you to to action or to whatever it's supposed to move you towards? Because I feel like I can look at. I don't know, I can look at any piece of evidence about anything, I don't know, about, trees or transportation, whatever, and not be moved by it. The question is, well, why should a piece of data or like a body of data move me to anything? I'm not.
It's a great question. And it's trying to explore the topic as he just presented in the most fruitful way. Like, what do you mean? It hasn't moved you,
Trying to kind of to trick you or to undermine you in any sense, but just trying to understand, what do you understand under this term that evidence should move you? Because that's like the way I see it is that, well, you're presented with evidence, and if something makes sense to you, then the most reasonable thing is for you to act in accordance with it. I mean, take the example of smoking. I mean, it's quite out of question that smoking damages your health. So that means that, well, people should be moved to not smoke, but that's not what happens. So the question is, or it seems to me that the problem is not with the evidence as such, which can or cannot move people to do something or to act in a certain way. So what is this moving? What do you think? I mean,
why this becomes such a cool philosophical conversation, because it moves into generically philosophical, and nobody's being defensive, right? So he's asking what is the potential answer? Like, I could see Dave Rollins trying to answer this, or Luke. What is it that moves somebody? Like, there are good faith. Let's take it out of atheism, Christianity. There are some questions where there are good faith people on both sides, and they've reached an impasse. Why? What's the intuition impasse needs to be understood clearly if we're to break the impasse. Why the impasse? What actually moves somebody? Are Christians and atheists just wired differently? Sometimes I thought that. Like, Christians tend to be more spiritual and intuitive, and atheists tend to be more, evil and eat babies. Did I just poison the well? I didn't mean to. I apologize. Craig, you just poisoned the well. I didn't mean to. Atheists are just evil and eat babies, like Emerson Green. Evil, eats babies. Why do you think he's? Of course, he doesn't want to find God. Why? Because then he'll have to stop eating babies and stop being evil. He doesn't want to. All right, I apologize for poisoning the well, but I'm very immature. Ask my wife. I have a limited time with sober analysis, and then I just, revert back to my childish self. I apologize.
Well, there are some arguments that I have experienced that have. So,
do you get what I'm saying, though? This is such a cool conversation. Gets to the root, because the real conversation that needs to be teased out, and this is why I started my approach, which was find an honest actor atheist, okay, Drew, for example, and really ask him, really try and understand what happened. Why? Because there are good faith people on both sides. And if we really want to move the needle, okay, apologetics is defense of the faith. Doesn't mean we have to be defensive at all. As far as I know, I'm not defensive. I don't think, but doesn't mean we have to be defensive. Ask the questions the right way and the answers reveal themselves, right?
Sort of moved me to change my beliefs, and it happens essentially non-consensually. This is the weird thing about becoming convinced of an argument. It just sort of happens to you, right? And so for example, when I first started considering arguments surrounding free will, when I was like 17 or something, and I'd never really thought about it, and I listened to the audiobook of Sam Harris's book about free will, and I'm just kind of staring off into space like, this is incredible. And that seemed to have an effect. And I think that the reason has got something to do with, maybe if you can present a sort of valid syllogism, a deductive argument in which I sort of believe the premises, then I have no choice but to believe the conclusion. And so natural theology has a number of deductive arguments, like the Kalam cosmological argument or the ontological argument or something. And I'm when I say that these arguments are sound, and I think that they're successful, what I mean is that they're valid, that they do actually work, and that the premises they seem intuitive. We have some good reason to believe them, but of course it all rides on exactly how much credence you give to those premises. And so when you're talking about something like smoking, we have fairly well-defined parameters. We know what sort of health.
He kind of said exactly what I've been saying when I bring up these arguments. They offer some evidentiary justification, but we have to raise the bar. So they offer sufficient evidentiary justification to move the honest actor, this person right here, to believe, because the evidence is sufficient. Put the way the apologists they always put down, I forget what his name is, evidence that demands a verdict, evidence that literally demands a verdict. That's the goal, and we aren't there yet. The sooner we acknowledge we're not there yet, the better chance we have of actually getting there.
Means we've defined it for our own purposes. We know the effects that smoking has on a body, this kind of thing, right? But when you're talking about everything that begins to exist has a cause, sure, yeah, I mean, that makes sense, because
it makes intuitive sense, but it might not be true, especially with what we know about quantum mechanics. And it's not a slam dunk unless the premise is an absolute case closed fact. And I'm not entirely certain that this is, I don't want to get into Kalam, and I don't want to debate Kalam, but this is why I think it offers some evidentiary warrant, but why I don't think it's all that strong of an argument. And it doesn't really matter. We can't just stop at Kalam. Can't go, hey, why do you believe in God? Kalam. Okay, we've done that. Why do you believe in God? Kalam. What evidence? Kalam. We can't keep doing that. We have to, keep going, be like dry apologist or Johann Ratz. Keep trying to create new and more improved arguments, right? New arguments that can't be argued with. That's the point.
I guess if it
he sort of just said that
didn't, then wouldn't this kind of thing happen all the time? Like, maybe but I don't know. Like, there's such a different grasp that we have on these kinds of considerations that, like, yeah, I think the argument's valid, and I think, sure, I mean, it makes sense that everything that begins to exist has a cause, but it doesn't have the same kind of undeniable force. And the only other thing is that because this is attached to a worldview that says that this is a God who is the author of the universe and has created the universe for you so that he can enjoy a relationship with you, I think I would expect something a little bit more strong than, my belief that a tree is green or something, or that, that this tree is 200 years old or something like that. I'd expect that if there were an argument that came along that were going to sort of push me onto theism, that the recognition that I'd actually become somewhere within me convinced that this was the case would be evidenced by the fact that I'd feel something a bit grander than the kind of experiences that would be attached to more, subtle beliefs.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, different people are obviously, there's going to be lots of factors that go into why a certain argument convinces one person but doesn't end up convincing another person, and that may not just be how sound the argument is, it might be their psychological kind of response to it and everything else, but ultimately we know that on the face of it, there are lots of people who are out there who've maybe heard a lot of the arguments, tried to kind of be as open as they can be, as Alex says he has been, Lukas, and say, But, despite all my openness and my searching and my reading of the Gospels, and even maybe I've tried to pray and just, put say, God, if you're there, respond, I'm open. They say it still hasn't happened. And on that basis, they say, if God is good, if God, as you say, wants to be in relationship with people, why hasn't it happened to me? Why are there other people like me it hasn't happened to? Is this evidence, therefore, that there's not a God on the other end? And so where do you go with that? Because in simple terms, that's sort of Schellenberger's argument, I think. It's that if there are these
it's a lot more powerful and intuitive in layman's terms. And the Schellenberg argument tries to formalize it, and it suffers from the same problem the Kalam suffers from. Okay, premise one, there are non-resistant non-believers. Okay, according to who? According to the non-believers. How do we know they're non-resistant? It doesn't work as an argument against ontology. It's a generalized intuition that is actually the thing that's moving the needle from belief to atheism. People who were Christian and can't pray and don't find, seek and don't find. As a generalized intuition, it is the most important, probably the single greatest deconversion tool is the hiddenness. Right? I think. I don't. Maybe I overstated that. I don't know. But how he said it is a lot more of a powerful summary of why it has force than the actual Schellenberg formal argument. The formal argument doesn't work. It's not. It doesn't cancel out an ontology. Why? Because same problem as with the Kalam. The premise has to be absolutely case closed, rock solid. Socrates is a man. I object. Okay, you're crazy. All men are mortal. I find flaws with that. Okay, you're crazy. That's the only way. There are non-resistant non-believers exist. Maybe. I know they think they're non-resistant. Maybe. That's the only possible response to that. That's why it's not a good formal argument, or it doesn't work. Non-resistant non-believers, premise one, non-resistant non-believers exist. Maybe. According to you, according to who? According to them. That's sketchy. Why? Because their self-reporting is non-resistant. How do we know they're non-resistant? That's what they're self-reporting as. Like I said, Answer from Reason Crew. Those are the closest people on planet Earth right now. Brett was probably a little bit more non-resistant than them. Not very evangelical. I used to tell him that all the time. You're not very evangelical as an atheist. He didn't try to debunk, dismiss, discredit me. Didn't try to go, well, how come you believe the talking snakes, Craig? He didn't pull any of the garbage with me ever. There are a lot of atheists who don't pull that garbage. How come you believe a donkey talk, Craig? You're so dumb. He never did any of that stuff. I gotta laugh. That was funny. They're the closest thing I have found in the present tense to a non-resistant non-believer. But if I were to sit down with Luke and talk and just ask him penetrating questions a la Pine Creek Doug, bet you $1,000 I'd find resistance. Where that might be a surprise to both me and him. I don't think they're lying. I don't think people are self-reporting as non-resistant and not telling the truth. I think they don't know that they're resistant. Why? Because it's hard to understand your resistance. Does the mother who downplays the evidence she finds that her son's smoking weed, does she know she's doing it? Of course not, or she wouldn't do it. This is where it gets weird. Why? Because not everything is epistemically accessible to the human being who reports it or is self-reporting.
Non-resistant atheists and non-believers, God, there's no reason he can't see any particularly good reason why God wouldn't be revealing God's self to that person.
Yeah, or not revealing himself yet. I think, and I've mentioned this,
yet. God might have good reasons. First of all, he's about to talk about this that nobody ever thinks about. But the idea that God is not in relationship with you just because you don't believe in God might not be true. I was thinking God may get enormous amount of satisfaction out of communing with a person when they're doing things that even though they don't believe in God, God is still present with them when they give birth to their child and experiencing something in communion with them, even though they don't believe in God. The idea that this all presupposes belief is also a way of thinking about this that I think ultimately is not the correct way. Proposition, belief, you believe the right proposition. I said that poorly, but I think everyone knows what I meant.
Previous to our conversation, I think there is a kind of a snapshot frame of reference you can take when talking about this problem of hiddenness, by which I mean, how do I feel about God, or how do I think about God today on this 11th of July in 2022? And it seems to me, someone might say, well, God is hidden. Well, I can't experience him. Again, both the Christian or the non-Christian may actually have that sort of sentiment or feeling. But then another way to look at the whole issue is, well, you look at the period of time and, well, how has God been revealing himself to me, or have I experienced some sort of increased relationship or increased depth of relationship with God? And here is, like, I'd like to get back to kind of to your specific case, Alex, if I'm allowed to call it that.
So his name was Alex. I was right about that. Okay.
I looked at, recently in your conversation with Joe Schmidt, where you put up this tier list for arguments for God's existence. You mentioned, and I was struck, I thought it was quite beautiful or inspiring. You said, the ontological argument is, now I don't know if you meant it sarcastically or anything, but you said it's beautiful. And you used the word, there's something magical about it, which to me suggests something very much along the lines of, well, this actually moves me, that this does something.
It's cool that he remembered that detail and brought it up in this conversation, because that's about to turn very interesting.
Something to me. Whereas, and so I went back and checked out what you said a couple of years ago about the ontological argument, and you literally said, I don't think this is even worth the time to bring it up in a debate. And so here's what I like to suggest. And there's other things which you mentioned about other arguments in that video or in that conversation with Joe Schmidt, where I thought, and I went back and checked out other videos, and I felt like, well, there's a very stark contrast. I mean,
this is the problem with YouTube. You can check what you said, 2 or 3 years ago.
So
yeah, exactly. Be careful of all the stuff you say on YouTube. I hope this will go down on your permanent record. Thank God. Thank freaking God. There was no Twitter or YouTube when I was in college. You guys would be amazed. And there's no way I wouldn't be canceled all the time. There's no way I wouldn't even be allowed on YouTube. I wouldn't be allowed to do anything, or I'd be totally canceled. I was, let's just say, different. I was pretty much the same, but try and imagine me, liquored up, and I couldn't even imagine, because half the time I was drunk, and I couldn't imagine if things were being filmed back then. My whole thing was shock and awe. Me and my friend today in Pasadena still do this. My wife calls us Dumb and Dumber. Me and my friend Mansoor, we still play South Park. And what I mean by play South Park is who can say the most shocking and outlandish thing to try and get a rise. And I usually win. I'm really good at it, say the most shocking and outlandish thing. So I still play South Park to this day. Back then, that's all I did. Get liquored up and say outrageous, awful things, usually to try and get a rise out of certain people. Oftentimes it was the feminists. So, wow, would I be canceled today? I'd be canceled and then canceled from being canceled. And I'd be in Alex Jones land, not allowed to be on any platform. I'd be persona non grata. Thank God there was no permanent record of that stuff back then. Or water under the bridge.
What I'd like to suggest is, so in a certain way, when you look at these arguments, or again, the ontological argument, which you now describe as beautiful or magical, couldn't you then somehow say that when you compare where you're at now in relation to where you stood 5 years ago, dare I say, could you say that with regard to this argument, God has kind of come out of the hiding? Because it does seem
such an insightful point. Nailed it. And he says it delicately. This is very smart of this guy. He perceived something that was pretty sharp to pick up on, and he starts saying it delicately so that it doesn't get so that Alex doesn't draw back into a shell and start going, no, don't score any points. But it's such an insightful point.
Beautiful to you now, and it does seem magical to you now.
I don't want to say it in Christianese, but to say it in Christianese is how most Christians would hear it. Hasn't God been working? God has been working on you. God has softened your heart. God has drawn you in. God is moving you.
Which it didn't a couple of years ago. So how, do you know what I mean? It's, well, I can think about God's hiddenness or God's evidence as I feel about it or think about it today, but I can also look at it how I've kind of developed and uncovered or discovered God.
We'll come back to that and hear what Alex has to say after a short break, because we take breaks here on The Unbelievable Show. And we're talking about divine hiddenness. My guest today, Lukas Ruegger and Alex O'Connor. Lukas runs the Deflate YouTube channel. Alex, of course,
yes.
the Cosmic Skeptic. And we'll
Deflate. I was right about that. Lukas Ruegger. Okay.
be back in just a moment.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the
This is quite powerful. I wouldn't say that sort of God has come out from hiding here. This is an example of me misunderstanding an argument, and then upon understanding it, thinking that it's very clever. And I don't think my view on how good it is has changed since then. Now, you could still say, well, here's still evidence of an argument that's put forward, which at first you say, that does nothing for me, it's ridiculous. And now you're saying, it's quite good. But this is kind of the problem all over again, because sure, I didn't understand the argument at first. Like, it's not like that was my fault. At least I don't think it was my fault. I was a teenager and I was trying to look at sort of the logic of possibilities, and I just didn't get it. And so maybe part of the reason why I was an atheist back then was because I'd heard an argument like that and I thought it's ridiculous. Now, maybe that's because of my misunderstanding, but even then, even if that is the case, it's like, what could I have done there? What could I have done differently? So maybe God just has good reason to sort of allow me to be mistaken, so that then in the future I become sort of a theist, and then maybe it's something to do with that journey that actually sort of shows people that, if they're experiencing doubts, that maybe that this is something that happens to people. But then there are all kinds of problems that are raised by that. For example, the problem of believing in libertarian free will as a theist. If you're the kind of theist that thinks that sort of my acceptance of the sacrifice of Jesus is somehow necessary to my salvation, then as long as you believe that there are sort of free human beings who are actually able to do what they like, then sure, maybe God has some grand plan whereby, I'm not a theist, and then 10 years in the future I become a theist, and this has some great sort of practical import. But maybe like 4 years into that, somebody sort of freely chooses to come and murder me. Somebody hits me with their car or something like that. And so I never actually make it that far. There seems to be a bit of a problem here for me, which is that, well, if the reason why I wasn't a theist at the moment of my death was because God was doing something himself, was like sort of purposefully trying to enact this plan where I eventually become a theist one day, but this gets interrupted because of the existence of free will, and so I end up going to the afterlife not saved. Mm-hmm. That seems incredibly unfair.
But that's sort of it's not ridiculous. I don't want to put him down, but that's kind of ridiculous. You're dealing with God. You got to, when you're thinking theologically, you cannot believe in God, but you have to think of God on God's terms. So you have to think theologically. An omnipotent God isn't going to be surprised by the day God, I was working on him and then he got hit by a car. I didn't know the car was gone. That's the notion. Now, I get an atheist isn't automatically thinking of God in omnipotent terms, but if you're asking the question, the way he framed the question, it's answered by that. Okay, God's working on it. What he just said was, God is working on me, but this raises a problem that doesn't actually raise. A lot of atheists do this. He rarely does this, but they create objections that don't make any sense. Okay, so God was working on his heart, but God doesn't know that he's about to be hit by a car tomorrow, so he's going to die without having, fully converted to Christianity. And God was like, oh, snap. I was going to save that guy. I know. What happened? It's just not how, it's just doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so maybe God sort of knows what I would have done had that not happened, in which case I kind of ask why it needed to be done at all in the first place.
That's a good that makes a little more sense, but that's just a philosophical question.
I understand that this could be an argument. It could be like, well, look, yeah, I know that you don't feel God's presence, and I know that he's not making himself known to you, but he's doing that on purpose. It seems strange to me to put that in the same argument or in the same position against this problem as saying that, but look, there is all of this evidence, there is all of this natural theology that you're sort of ignoring or not understanding or rejecting, but then also saying that actually, no, the reason that you don't feel God is because God has good reason to sort of hide himself from you. These seem to rub up against each other, as well as, of course, the scripture seems to be littered with references to the idea that people should be able to believe in God. You know, the fool in his heart says there is no God. Romans 1 is a famous example of people saying that this is God saying that essentially the evidence that's been provided to everybody is such that they are without excuse for not having belief in him. I don't mind somebody saying, yeah, that's what Romans 1 means, and it's correct that there is enough evidence for everybody, and you're just somehow missing it or ignoring it or something. Or somebody saying, you know, that there actually isn't enough evidence that's been provided to you, and God has good reason for that. But I don't think you can do both at once.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's have a few responses then to some of those thoughts.
There was a lot there. I think just as a comment on the side, I don't know whether it makes sense for us to go in. I mean, I understand where you're coming from by saying, well, if God would allow me to kind of wrestle with all this stuff and all the arguments without coming to believe, and the grand plan is this and that, but maybe it can get messed up. I mean, I guess that's a slightly different question regarding divine.
All right, so I'm going to do a part 2 to this, where I take it from this point forward, because as good as all that was, and that was really, really good, this is where it really goes. This is what transpires from now for the next half hour is why I was moved to make the video. So I'm running out of time right now, about an hour. I don't want to do things more than an hour these days. You know, that's about people's tolerance level for all things Craig Reed. Asking people to sit in on Craig Reed for longer than an hour seems to be a stretch. I understand. You're awesome, though, Craig. I understand. It's awesome. It's an awesome channel and do awesome work. I know all that. I didn't ask. But, you know, demanding of people's attention longer than an hour, I'm trying to avoid that in times to come. So I thought there was a lot in just what we heard. I thought was phenomenal to some degree, but it gets even better. I think the next half hour, Alex just goes, you know, he can be really a smart and thoughtful person, and he's really, really insightful. And he, you know, really thinks through a lot of this stuff and takes it very personally. So the stuff he's about to say is the best part of the video. So I'll do a part 2. You know, just what we heard, I thought was great. Like I said, watch this. You know, this is the type of conversation that can be watched over more than one time, because there's a lot here. This guy, the Christian on this is doing a really good job of not asserting himself too much into the conversation, is kind of teasing out, you know, this is really almost about what I tried to do with my conversations with atheists, is tease out the what's really going on here. What is really at work? Let's hear the truth. That's what I did with my conversation with Drew. That's what I did with my conversation with Apologia. And to some degree, it's what I try and do all the time. This guy's doing it. He's trying to not really assert an argument or a proposition, or, well, you didn't know, obviously, when you say that, because he didn't even do it here, where Alex was sort of almost asking, you know, almost laying it down as, give me the apologetic here. And a lot of other Christians would have stepped right on that and stepped in it by doing it. Why? Because you just, when people are opening up, you know, let the truth be spoken and come out. We don't have to answer all the objections. That's part of the flaw in a lot of the atheist thinking, is that somehow I have to answer all their objections to Christianity. I don't. A lot of them you can answer for yourself. A lot of them don't amount to very much. I would say most of them don't amount to very much, and you can answer them yourself. And they've designed this so that, you know, you're the one making a positive claim, Craig. So they put us into this position where we have to answer everything that they say. This conversation doesn't do that. I don't think any of these conversations should do that. It's the atheist responsibility, It's not up to me to answer all their objections to Christianity. They need to sort through them for themselves and decide, do these objections amount to much? A lot of them don't. Like I said, huge chunk of them don't. And then we do apologetics on the ones that do amount to much and try to supply sufficient argumentation and sufficient evidentiary justification to move this person right here, the honest actor, to go, wait a minute, Craig is right. That is sufficient evidence. I need to start praying and seeking the Lord again. So I'm gonna let it end here. Honestly, I thought this conversation so far, what we got from these two was so much better than what you get on so many of these channels, these back and forths. It's night and day compared to the other conversations. But I think if I remember correctly, now I've only watched this once through, and like all things I watch, I'm not listening very carefully. I have it on my headphones. I'm doing other things. So I could be mistaken, but if I remember correctly, the next half hour is where it really gets good. So I will wrap it up. That is all for now, kids. As always, the Mass is ended. Go in peace. A great conversation. Go watch it. It's a good channel, by the way. Mass is ended. Go in peace. Amen.